to ask Eve if she would please introduce our speaker.
Sure. Thank you, Jane. So I first came across Bank.Green on a podcast over a year ago now. I realized it was in February last year, and it was a podcast about people switching careers to more greener careers, and Bank.Green was one of the ones that was on there. And I reached out to Zach because I thought this is a topic that might be interesting to a Speak Up for Our Planet audience, but also just is very interesting to anyone who is thinking about how can we make a difference with our money, which is something that all of us can do. So Zach is the co-founder and executive director of Bank.Green. He manages growth, content, and partnerships for the platform, crafting digital strategies and trying to increase public pressure on the banking industry to redirect finance flows away from fossil fuel expansion. And he will explain much more about this and about Bank.Green in his talk. So thanks so much for being with us tonight, Zach, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Eve. Nice to be here. I'll make one very minor correction, is that we like to refer to ourselves as Bank.Green, although I appreciate that it's confusing because there is a dot, because our name is the same as the URL where you'll find us on the internet. But Bank.Green to us signifies a kind of call to action as well to all of our visitors to actually Bank.Green. So yeah, but thank you very much for that warm introduction. I will switch over to the slideshow, which we know is working. So this is going to be a presentation that you see here, but then also towards the end, I'll actually jump onto our website and show you, how you might benefit from using it. But I think before we do that, it will probably help to provide a little bit about context of what we do at Bank.Green and why we think it's an important part of the fight against climate change. So here's just a quote that I like that I'd encourage you to keep in mind as I go through the rest of the presentation. Bill McKibben, some of you may have heard of. He's the famous environmentalist who founded 350 in the US. And the quote is that money is the oxygen on which the fire of global warming burns. So quite a provocative statement, and one that hopefully will become more apparent as we move through the rest of the presentation. So, yeah, not to repeat too much of what Eve's already said, but I'm the executive director of Bank.Green. I'm born and raised in London, but I currently live in Mexico City. As an organization, we're spread all over the world. There's 43 of us at the moment, volunteers. We were founded on Earth Day in 2021, so we're coming up to our 3rd anniversary. And prior to that, I had been working as an activist with Extinction Rebellion, helping them with their digital global strategy, because they are obviously from the UK, but they have branches all over the world. We're currently volunteer driven. We've received our first grant recently, which I'm very pleased about, but it's not enough to pay for 43 salaries. So predominantly volunteer driven. And I personally have a digital marketing business that supports me, which is what it enables me to work on this. I love to volunteer in general. I help out with some food banks and shelters here in Mexico City. I think it's a great use of time. And on a personal level, I do what I can to help with the climate crisis in terms of my consumption habits. And I think this is actually very much a consumption habit that people very often overlook, because you don't really think of your bank as a sort of the same relationship that you have with a big clothing brand or whatever. But actually, what we want people to do is to begin to consider it in the same grouping, I suppose you could say. So it may seem obvious, but I want to give a little bit of explanation about what banks do have to do with the climate crisis. Banks are essentially the engines of the real economy, by which I mean that all companies and businesses do depend on them for working capital to produce what they're doing. And the way that happens is by banks providing loans and attaching conditions to those loans. And based on those conditions and those criteria, they can have enormous influence on the behavior of the companies that they're financing. Amongst those that they do finance, as you would guess, are fossil fuel companies who are directly responsible for the production of greenhouse gas emissions. So how do banks help fossil fuel companies? Well, in three ways. They invest often through them. I'm going to sort of go backwards here. They invest through their asset management arms and hold equity. They help them with certain services. For example, if they want to go public, if they want to merge, those types of things, and they take a fee for that. But if you crack the numbers, you come to realize that far and away the largest amount of money that they provide for the industry is via their financing activities, which is a mixture of these loans that we were talking about, and then also they act as intermediaries if these companies wish to issue bonds and shares and so forth. So that's the part that we're focusing on, and that's what needs to change. And how much have they done this? To what tune have they done this? Well, $5.5 trillion since the Paris Agreement in late 2015. And that's quite an astonishing amount of money that they provided that industry. It's 4.36 trillion pounds, or 4,300 billion pounds, that has been offered and to support the fossil fuel industry in its activities. And that amounts to more than 2 billion a day. So kind of eye-watering statistics, if you ask me. In terms of Europe, who are the biggest offenders? Well, Barclays is out in front. They've supplied $191 billion, and HSBC not far behind with 145. But the interesting thing to note is that even though they're pouring so much money into the industry, in most cases, fossil fuel companies only make up between 2 and 15% of their portfolio, and in most cases, it's actually around sort of 4 to 5% of their portfolio. So that shows us that the banks don't actually need the fossil fuel industry to make a profit, but the fossil fuel industry definitely needs banks for their working capital. So how far have banks changed so far in terms of what they're doing? So what really needs to happen is all of that capital needs to be reallocated to renewable energy, low carbon energy, as we call it, which is dominated by renewables. At the moment, the most optimistic statistics that Bloomberg have provided is that in terms of a ratio, it's about 48% of capital from global banks is going towards renewables, and around 52% towards fossil fuels. And that represents a pretty big uptick over the last few years, but it's still not nearly enough. So if you look at this graph, the purple line is roughly where we are. And we're around 1, if you look at the axis on the left. And that's, again, like I said, about a 1-to-1 ratio. But in order to avoid 1.5 degrees of global warming, and I'm sure I don't need to tell everyone here that's the limit set by the Paris Agreement, and anything above that is leading to catastrophic levels of warming. We need to get up to 4% by the end of this decade. So you can see there where it says 21 to 30, that's the end of the decade. So there needs to be 4 times as much investment into renewables than fossil fuels. And you can see what that does to the graph, right? So it doesn't look super likely at the moment, but that is what needs to happen. Otherwise, we're basically screwed. So what can we do? Now that you know about the problem, we're not just here to talk about problems, we're here to offer solutions. And that's what we at Bank Green are working on. So we generate public pressure to reduce banks funding fossil fuels, and we do it in a few ways. We have an online bank checking tool that I'm about to show you that's so far been used over 400,000 times by bank customers to check the climate impact of their banks. Then when you have this information, just like the information I just gave you, what can you do about it? Well, one really effective action you can take is to switch your deposit to a greener bank, where your money will not only be divested from fossil fuels, but it'll actually be invested in sustainable infrastructure, and in the best cases, as I mentioned, like renewable energy. So we are curating a list of those green banks, some of which we've certified as fossil free as part of a growing alliance, and I'm going to expand on that in a little bit. But we also do encourage customers to advocate with their banks to reduce lending to fossil fuels. So maybe you're not in a position to switch, you have a mortgage, you have some financial product that ties you in for a certain number of years, and we wish to give you tools and resources so you can actually voice your concern to your banks. We have actually switched £25 million based on our user surveys for those who actually switched. It's actually probably likely higher than that because that's only from the surveys. And as we know, not everyone fills out, most people don't fill out surveys. And we're trying to bring about a lot more of that activity. And one thing people often think about green banks is that they're not, they're taking some sort of, having to take some sort of trade-off. But actually, if you look at the evidence, in many cases, you're actually getting a better experience with the green bank. So Triodos is considered sort of the gold standard in Europe. Their equivalent online saver account is to Barclays every day. You can see you get 3% interest with them versus 1.65 with Barclays. And Barclays is Europe's #1 funder of the fossil fuel industry. And somebody already mentioned the Global Alliance on Banking for Banking on Values, of which Triodos is a member. So just to kind of work against that misconception is that sometimes it's true, but if you look around and, you know, we obviously try to bring that information to you, you can often get an even better deal with your new green bank. So why do we think it matters? Your voice matters. Well, banks do listen to their customers. Often the retail divisions make up a pretty significant portion of their entire operations. They're concerned about the possible loss of revenue from their customers if they're acting collectively, and then they're also concerned about PR. You know, there's obviously a lot of risk associated with what they're up to, and they don't want people to know about it. They're very happy to talk about their sustainable activities. Very rarely do you hear what they're doing about fossil fuels. So the more of a noise we can make about that, the more we can put that reputation on the line. And then there's a lot of customers that they haven't won over yet, you know, university students, things like that, and they care a lot about that new cohort. So again, if you can begin to tarnish their reputation in the public eye, then that really starts to matter to them. There have been a number of successful campaigns in the past similar to this. Obviously, most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with apartheid, and there was a boycott, huge campaign to boycott Barclays from UK university students between 1970 and 86, I think, where, you know, thousands of accounts were closed with Barclays, and then eventually they did the right thing and they pulled out of South Africa. So, you know, there is evidence that this can work, and there are other organizations like Go Fossil Free that have been tremendously successful over the last decade in getting other institutions to divest from fossil fuels, and they're all driven by people power. So I'm not sure how we're doing for time. Is anyone counting? I want to not go over my allotment.
No, you're doing fine. You're doing fine.
Yeah?
At least another 10 minutes. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so now we can look at the website itself, which I'll just expand this again. Okay, so this is what you're met with when you come on the Bank Green website. A little bit of a storytelling of types of things that I've just spoken about, and it allows you to search many different countries. The UK is still our main focus for information about your bank. So let's imagine we're with Barclays. Sorry, set a country first. I'm doing this completely wrong. I think I never used it. So you pick a country and then you pick your bank, and then you click check my bank. And here, you know, we learn that they're #1 in Europe for fossil fuel financing, and you see some statistics about what they've been up to and the types of things that they've been financing and how much money they've given and so forth. And again, a little bit more storytelling for those who are new to this area. And what we really encourage people to do, if they're in a position to, is to move their money. So you could then click here, and this brings you to our directory, if you will, of green banks. Already it's got the UK selected because the website knows where you're visiting from, and then you have all these filters here, so you can actually, depending on what your needs might be, so you can find a bank that's best suited to you. As someone pointed out, Metro, after recent analysis, has turned out to be a very good bank actually, from that perspective. And so yeah, and then if you want, some of them we've done in-depth reviews about, like Triodos, who I've already mentioned. You can see all their accreditations here. This is all completely free to use, just to be clear. You don't have to sign up for anything. Here are some key facts, and then you can read more about them along various different dimensions. So that is giving you, information on who you might wish to switch to. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute because there's more to say about this alliance. You can see there's a a seal here that says fossil free certified, which I think I touched on earlier, is that that's part of our research process, but we're evolving that initiative to become something a bit more broad, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But I just wanted to also talk about the other ways of taking action, because again, we do understand that certain people might prefer to engage with their bank for various reasons. I mean, we still encourage people to do that even if they don't bank with a particular institution. You can always, as a member of the public, write to them or call them and let them know. But maybe you're with this bank and you prefer to see them do better than switch for any reason. So we have this section up here called Take Action. And here we outline a few of the different ways that you can engage. And obviously switching, we've just been through, and there's a step-by-step guide also on the blog on the things you might want to look out for if you're switching. But right now I'm going to talk about how to apply pressure. This is going to look a little bit different in the next month or two, because we're releasing a tool that will allow you to write letters. It actually uses AI to help you to write letters of concern or emails of concern to your bank. But as of now, we kind of give you information on how to start a conversation with them. And my favorite way personally is to make a phone call. Banks very rarely get phone calls about their climate performance. So it'll definitely stand out. And calls also trigger, internal feedback processes. So, you're entitled, especially as a customer, but even as a non-customer, to get a response and to keep pressuring them until they give you a response from someone in management. So the customer service person, very often you'll probably find they're as surprised as you are when you come to them with information about what their bank's up to. So you might feel nervous, but I'd say try not to, because it's just another human being, and you might be giving them an epiphany that they didn't have before, and they might take it on their shoulders to actually really see this through and see what they could do internally, or maybe get an employee resource group together. But yeah, here are some talking points that you might want to use, and obviously there's more on the actual bank page itself, so you might want to make some notes before your call, just so you know exactly what you're going to say. There's another website that I can link to afterwards called Fossil Bank's No Thanks, that goes into even more detail than we do on each individual bank and which projects they're funding and how much they're funding and all that kind of thing. So it's good to try and prepare a little list of those before you call, and what you actually want them to answer about. And then we also encourage you to call the investor relations line if you can, because the executives there have a sort of direct line to senior management. So very often you can just Google, Barclays Investor Relations, HSBC Investor Relations, and you'll be able to find a number. But that's not to say that calling the regular customer service line is ineffective. I don't think it is at all. And just as I mentioned, be really clear to say, I want you to please log this call, and please, here's my information, and please come back to me and let me know when you'll come back to me, and so on. And when banks experience lots of people doing that, that is going to have an impact, and that is going to come up in their meetings, and it's going to be something that they realize is now becoming a risk for them amongst their customers. So obviously there's other methods here, like sending an email or letter. As I mentioned, we're going to empower people to do that much more easily very soon. And then if you have a local branch, you can also go in there. So that's on the pressuring side. I've spoken a little bit about switching. And then I'm going to come lastly on to sharing. So let me just zoom out of the website for now. That's kind of the main functionality of the website at the moment. It's a directory of bad banks and good banks, and we do everything to try to facilitate you either switching or engaging. But then an overlooked part of this fight is, bear with me 1 second, sorry. In addition to those things, something that's also extremely powerful is sharing the message, because the biggest part of our the biggest challenge to us at the moment, I would say, is the awareness gap on this problem. Like, we're all interested in climate change and what we can do. A lot of people sort of say they are, but they don't necessarily attend talks like this or take personal actions. But when it comes to banking, the recent statistics show that 80% of bank customers have no idea what their banks are financing, much less that they're pouring this much money into the fossil fuel industry, much less that they're using money from their accounts to actually do that. I'm not sure if I mentioned that yet, but that's, to me, a big misalignment of values when you find out your own money is working against you in this way. So the biggest challenge is really to get the word out. And in the particular survey I'm referring to, 12.5% of those customers who were with Barclays and HSBC said that they'd be very likely to switch now that they knew this information, right? So on an individual and ultimately collective level, you can come on the website, you can share the graphics that are, express your disapproval of what your bank might be up to. You can tag the bank you're switching to reward them in a way and let them know, encourage them to do more of the right thing. Equally, you can tag the banks you're switching away from and make it very public that you know what they're up to. We do something we call green trolling sometimes when there's greenwashing happening from some of these banks. We'll often correct their ads for them and make it very public. So here Barclays are saying we finance and advise companies. They were talking about sustainable companies and we changed it to fossil fuel companies, and they got quite a lot of laughs from our own followers. And I'm going a little bit out of order here, but one thing I just wanted to touch on is that we until now have been relying on a fairly basic evaluation methodology for the banks. And I say basic, that's not a knock against it. But it's been relying on a lot of other NGOs and their findings because we're volunteer driven. Until recently, we didn't have that many volunteers to do the research, but we've recently launched our own methodology. And what that means is we're going to be re-rating all of the banks in our database, starting with the UK. And we've actually done the majority of UK banks so far. We just haven't updated everything on the website yet because there's a lot of things that need to happen. So we're aiming to do that in the next month. We're going to be officially launching this methodology on Earth Day. So while you can put a pretty high degree of trust in what you're already seeing on there, if you're thinking of switching, you may want to leave it a few weeks, maybe a month until we've done that. And we'll be putting it, please do follow us on social media and so on, so you can know about when we've done that. And this new methodology doesn't exist anywhere. There isn't a holistic rating of a bank's climate performance anywhere in the public domain, at least not that I'm aware of. So we're quite excited about it. And it will cover things like, if anyone's interested, obviously lending to fossil fuel companies, the ratio that I was talking about of lending to renewable energy versus fossil fuels. So I'm going, from left to right. Exclusion policies are very important, like what types of fossil fuels are absolutely no-go. Governance over climate risks, measurement of financed emissions, which financed emissions are what we call scope 3 emissions. Those are the emissions that the bank is not themselves responsible for, but they are ultimately responsible for them because they're supplying capital to these companies who are producing them, right? So those are the emissions that are financed, and that's what we're really focused on here. If the bank has any history of lobbying, for example, against climate legislation, and then we want to see really robust climate targets, both long-term and medium-term as well. So those are the sorts of areas that are all going into these scores, and we'll still see the same sort of great, good, okay, bad, worst, but they're going to be informed by a score between 1 and 100, depending on where a bank falls. It'll achieve that particular score. And what this methodology is going to allow us to do is to also provide a much more robust alliance criteria. So right now, the alliance that I mentioned to you that we're building is just banks who don't finance fossil fuels. But what you find is sometimes those banks, they may not find, like a lot of building societies, for example, they just provide mortgages to their members. They don't finance fossil fuels for the most part, but they also don't invest in a sustainable future. So those will kind of still be the fossil-free members, and that's good. And if you want to divest and just divest, then you can move to them. But this alliance we're creating, which will be called the Bank Green Alliance, to help with our branding, will first and foremost be promoting banks and building societies and other institutions that are not only divested from fossil fuels, but that are taking positive steps as measured by these criteria to invest in a sustainable future. So those are the ones that will be really encouraging people to actually divert their money to, for those who are doing that. So I just wanted to give a little plug for that, to let you know also that the website is slightly out of date, but if you really want to move your money tomorrow, then you can still do that with confidence. So that's the end of the talk. In terms of what you can do now, you can check your bank score on Bank Green, which I showed you how to do. You can decide on which type of pressure you might like to apply, and whether or not you do apply or switch or engage, you can always share the message, and we have some share graphics that you can include, and obviously that involves just talking to your friends and families. social movement, flashy PR campaigns are all well and good, but social movements are built on that human to human interaction. So even though it may feel odd or strange, like, we really encourage you to just get talking to people about this issue and get them to understand how important it actually is in perpetuating the climate crisis. As a bonus, if you wish, we have a volunteers page if anyone wants to come and help us and has any particular skills, which we've listed a few roles up there that we're looking for. You can find our newsletter on bank.green/join if you wish to keep up to date with the space in general, both on fossil finance, as we call it, and sustainable finance, which is two sides of the same coin. Yeah, and I suppose if anyone knows any rich funders that would be interested in helping accelerate our journey, then of course we'd always be very welcome, very receptive to that as well. But yeah, that's basically it. And I guess I will pass over back to Eve now, if people have been writing any questions.
Thank you very much. Could you take your screen down so we can see everybody?
Yes.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Perfect.
Thank you, Zach.
So what questions do we have? My brain is just whizzing with things. So
I have one while we wait for more to come in the chat. Sometimes, Zach, when I talk to friends about this, they say like, oh yeah, but I don't have much money in that account anyway, and I don't really like use it much or something, but they're still like, they still have an account. They're still like a customer of that bank. So like, how sort of, but they're not like maybe a customer that the bank cares too much about, because they don't have a huge amount of money in the, like, so what would you say to people in that kind of position?
Well, thanks for that. The first thing I would say was, as I mentioned, the sharing of the message is still a really critical thing that anyone can do, that you don't even need to have a bank account. Because if you tell 10 people that do, maybe you have a rich friend who it would have more of an impact and you persuade them to switch. But on a personal level, I haven't worked at a bank. My brother does, ironically. But I would venture that unless you're talking about sort of high net worth, ultra high net worth individuals, like, the impact that you would have by closing your account and making it very clear to the bank why you're closing the account would have just as much impact if you had £10 in there as if you had 100,000. I don't think in those conversations so this is one of the things in those steps I showed you on how to switch. Towards the end of the process, the absolutely most important thing that you can't overlook is to tell your bank why you're leaving them. Because people are closing accounts every day for all kinds of reasons, and you've just lost the entire power that you had by not messaging to them like what the problem was and why you're dissatisfied. And I would guess that in the internal meetings they have, they don't probably analyze, say they got 10, 100 people last month who all did that. I don't think they would necessarily look inside their deposit accounts. Oh, well, this person only had £10, so we're just gonna. It doesn't really matter, Like, they know what they're doing, and they know someone could be just as upset about it, if they were a millionaire versus if they just had, a few quid, or whatever. So I still think it matters.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to take some of these questions from the chat. Alan Budden says, are the good banks listed in order on your website, i.e. the best at the top? He understands that would change.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a great question. So we are, at the moment, we've released a feature that says top picks. So you'll see some of them have top picks on there. We understand that people need to be able to move with confidence and to bank with confidence. And, there is, so we're not just going to spotlight green banks, without any sort of qualification to that as well, because we don't want people to switch and do the right thing for the planet and then find out they have to switch back because the bank they switch to has a terrible service offering. And so we're very aware of that. That's why we have these reviews, and that's why we now have this top picks facility So these are ones that like maybe one of our team has banked with, or we've done, a thorough top to bottom kind of review of the actual service as separate from the environmental credentials of that bank. So that's why, if you see a top pick, we might sort of expand on that and explain, why we think they're a top pick, etc. But that means that's like, covers all the bases. When the Bank Green Alliance is launched in the next month or so, those, instead of the fossil free, there will still be a label that says if a bank's fossil free or building society, and the seal will instead say Bank Green Alliance, and then those ones are going to be sort of prioritized in the pecking order. So those ones are considered great in our rating methodology. We will still include banks that are considered okay and good, but they will fall to the bottom. So if you use sort of some combination with those that appear at the top, and then look out for that top picks badge, and then of course your own criteria that you have, the things that you're looking for, that's probably the best recipe to find the best kind of overall bank for you. Does that make sense?
Does that answer your question, Alan?
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. I just wondered whether the top one was the best. We should always go to the top one, which is maybe unfair on some of the others who are doing just as good.
No. So we are going to be adjusting the algorithm when the alliance is launched, so that the alliance members appear at the top. Yeah. So in theory, there is one that could have better service that drifts to the bottom, but the reason he's not towards the top is because our first priority is the environment. Obviously, that's why people are on the website, and then we're going to be using the top picks aspect to try to also pluck out the ones that we think are excellent from a service standpoint as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So next question, how do you score the impact of bank lending to companies who have both fossil fuel and renewable energy projects?
That's a great question. I think in the most cases, it's, companies like BP and so on, it's still a pretty minuscule proportion of their business. And so we kind of we actually look quite granularly at their annual reports. There's a company called the Carbon Disclosure Project that has a climate questionnaire that we actually can see sort of line items. Yes, there are general corporate loans that do go to the entire companies. My answer to that would be, I think in most cases of the majors, as they call them, renewables is still a very small portion of their overall lending. So I think in that case, not that doesn't matter, but it just doesn't factor very largely into our calculations. And then there are various figures that we pick out that actually show specific lending to fossil fuel projects from those companies. So the level of detail of the data is we get as granular as we possibly can, and that's sort of enough to satisfy us. We might publish more information as the methodology evolves, but there's very little. In our view, there's very little error, sort of margin for error of like getting it particularly wrong and say, okay, we gave, we tallied this amount to this company, but it turns out this company is actually like 90% renewables. We wouldn't have got the number in the first place if that were the case. So that's probably the best answer I can give.
Okay.
Rosie, do you want to ask your own question?
Okay. I was interested, Zach, in the comment towards the end where you're saying if any of us have some rich friends that could be an investor in Bank Green. And I was actually interested as an organization, as you grow, do you intend to eventually monetize your expertise and service? Is that something that you intend to do? Because you're obviously building a real expertise and commitment, if you like, to people. So that was it. Yeah,
thank you. That's a great question. So there's a whole initiative that we've done that I didn't have the time to go into, that Eve and Jane have seen. So that's one way we're trying to monetize. It's a tool, it's an AI tool that we built called the Green Policy Evaluator. And actually, if you look in the footer of our website after this talk, you can click and see what that looks like. And that is kind of does what it says on the tin, is it looks at these sustainability policies of banks, and they're often very long and messy. And it has the ability to sort of distill them and apply a score to them. So then you can begin to compare banks kind of apples to apples and see who's doing the best on Arctic drilling, or who's doing the worst on Arctic drilling, who's doing the worst on fracking, that kind of thing. And our goal with that is actually to integrate the findings of that into our methodology to provide an even more comprehensive score. We're hoping that'll happen at some point this year. And then we're also aiming to sell that tool to other financial campaigners who do a lot of policy research, because it can really speed up the policy research. So that's one area we're trying to monetize, and we'll see where that goes. The Bank Green Alliance, because we're already driving new business from climate conscious bank customers to these banks, we are aiming to assess a fee for inclusion within the Bank Green Alliance. So we'll begin to see how that pans out in the next few weeks. And then finally, we are currently intending, still in discussions, but we've found a little bit more tricky than we would have liked, to discuss kind of referral commissions from these green banks that we're referring a lot of business to. Nationwide in particular, we've generated thousands of customers for them. And yeah, I'm not really sure what that is. I think it's maybe in the US, it's a bit more sort of understood that that's the way things are. And we certainly, if such time we do that, it's going to be in an entirely impartial way, right? So if only one bank gives us a referral fee, we're not going to play favorites or promote them more than others, and we'll make that very clear in any agreements we enter into, because our impartiality, I think, is why people would come to us and respect our opinion. So what we're considering doing, we haven't fully decided, is instead of giving them customers immediately, asking people to help with our impact, because it will really help with our impact. So if you want to have an impact, you can help us as well if you wish, to offer them as leads. So if someone wants to switch to Triodos or Nationwide, if you're willing to, obviously we can't stop you doing that if you just want to do it today. But if you want to help our cause and you believe in it, then we'd invite people to give them our email addresses, and then which bank were you thinking of switching to? Okay, now we have 100 people this week who want to switch to Nationwide. We can go to them and potentially sell them as leads. So that's just something we've been discussing recently. It's not fully decided upon yet, but yeah, we and then individual donations as well. We're going to start running more campaigns to try and to generate more of those. So we're not relying on a very wealthy donor to come into our lives, but I'm always going to ask.
You wouldn't object.
I wouldn't object if someone wanted to come and give us £1 million, but yeah.
Okay, we have another question. Alan says, it's my impression that there has been some kickback about environmental investing from the retail investment community. How is the banking sector reacting to the groundswell of climate activism?
The groundswell of climate activism, or do you mean sort of reaction against ESG? I understood them as slightly different questions.
Alan, do you want to fill him in on exactly what you meant?
Yeah, Zach, I'm aware that ESG was absolutely flavour of the year 2 or 3 years ago, and materially less so right now. Mm-hmm. And I'm just interested to know, I appreciate banking and investment are rather different issues, different parts of the balance sheet and all that stuff. But I guess I'm just interested to know how you think the banking sector is reacting to I guess your kind of activism, your very methodical and very well organized activism.
Yeah, thank you. So there have been certain pledges made by large banks about divestment and sort of aligning their lending portfolios with net zero commitments and so on. But equally, there's been backtracking, like Barclays recently did, on their exclusion for certain types of coal companies. While progress has been made, it's been much too slow, and it is with many campaigning movements, it's often quite hard to draw a direct line of causality between, because the banks aren't going to, in their press release, say, yeah, you know what, Bank Green was right. We were wrong all along. They'll dress it up to make it look as though, we were going to do this all along. We just needed, a little bit more time. And I think what I would say is that even though, I mentioned my history with Extinction Rebellion, I sort of grew out of the campaign movement. Our feeling is that that's like really important pressure, but it's also from the campaigning movement specifically is quite kind of binary. As in, you need to divest completely tomorrow, or you're public enemy number one, kind of thing. And as our thinking has evolved, we've kind of adopted a more conciliatory approach, understanding that there are certain types of investments that a bank can't legally extricate themselves from, in such a short span of time. There's a question of stranded assets. It's all about pacing the transition, and campaigners always think it's too slow, and banks think they're being pressured to do it too fast. So we think we can have the most impact by having a more conciliatory approach, trying to work with the banks themselves. And we've already received, emails from Lloyds, NatWest, several large institutions who are very sensitive about their representation on our website, and we're still a relatively small website. We're not money saving expert yet. So that sort of tells me that once this new methodology is released, and we have more kind of acumen, I suppose, to back up these scores, we're probably going to get even more of that. And it tends to be the more climate forward banks that are the sensitive ones, right? Because they think they're being unfairly represented, whereas I think Barclays and in America, JP Morgan Chase and stuff, I don't think they have a leg to stand on, so they don't kind of try. So whereas in general, to sum this up, I think movement has been very slow, but I think it's very fair to attribute the positive wins to the campaigning movement. We're adopting a slightly kind of middle of the road approach that we're hoping will lead to even more divestment and a faster transition amongst those banks. So we'll see if that's correct. In the new methodology, I should say up front, for example, NatWest and Lloyds, who are not enamored, the campaigning movement are not enamored with them in general, will actually receive a good rating. They won't be part of the alliance. We won't invite them to join the alliance now, but they, NatWest in particular, has around 10 times the amount of renewable investment as it does fossil fuels. So it did still give, I think, around £1 billion or something like that to fossil fuels last year, but for that it gave almost 10 times as much to low carbon energy. So we really also want to reward banks who are showing themselves to adopt the right direction of travel. We know it's going to cause some controversy amongst some of our peers, but we're quite happy to take a strong stance on that. And so, similar to what I was saying before, we said, if you're looking to switch, you can go to NatWest. You'll still be divesting. You will be helping the transition for sure. But they're not sort of creme de la creme. So you might want to consider Triodos or someone like that.
Is that helpful? Great. So I think you went some way towards answering this question already, but how do you do the measurement of your own reach and impact? And do you as an organization use that data to have conversations with the banks that need to change?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in the last year or so, we've been very busy with our heads down building things. So we've been building this AI tool that I mentioned. We've been working a lot on our methodology and applying it, building our capacity. And so while we experienced decent growth over the last sort of 2-3 years, just through kind of word of mouth, search engines and so on, we're now sort of at the beginning of what I would consider our growth phase. We're actually bringing someone on to sort of work on that in a dedicated way. And so the metrics that we've been looking at are still important, and we do especially look at how much money has been switched. So if you come on our website, you'll get a pop-up when you leave saying, have you used our website to switch? And again, the amount for now comes to around $30 million, so 25 million pounds. And yeah, we haven't had such conversations yet. We haven't introduced that. It more sort of helps us with fundraising and so on to talk about that kind of impact. And also the amount of times our checking tool has been used, about 400,000 times. So those are the types of things, the awareness raising and then the actual impact, which is the switching for those who switch. Once our second AI tool is released, we'll also be recording how many people are using that to send letters and engage. And then, yeah, I think, of course, every conversation we have with a bank who's sort of maybe on the fence or showing some certain signs that they're willing to begin to sort of improve their lending practices, I would definitely think that we'll be using that to sort of impress upon them that we matter and that this movement matters, right? We're just part of this movement. Yeah.
So your question's next, Eve. Do you want to ask it?
Yep. I think you touched on this, Zach, when we looked at the tool, or the sort of the way that you're going about this previously, but I was wondering if you could explain the extent to which the new methodology that you're using to rate the banks considers things beyond the fossil fuel industry and renewable energy investments, such as like nature and biodiversity considerations, and how much of that is part of the kind of mapping that you're doing.
Yeah, this I kind of always wish I had my colleague here, Catherine, because she's the mastermind behind the methodology, and because I think she'll be able to provide a more thorough response. So I can always also get back to you. I think our view, and in terms of the published data, this sort of lending low carbon energy ratio, as it's called, is very easy to sort of latch onto, and also is going to have the most impact from an emission standpoint, right? So that is kind of where we grew from, like, you know, Extinction Rebellion, etc. Like that, they're very concerned about fossil fuels and investment in fossil fuels and biodiversity. So I misspoke there slightly. Extinction Rebellion in particular are also very interested in biodiversity, but we took that ball and ran with it. And so we're not to discount the importance of conservation efforts and that kind of thing at all. It's just that's not the area that we're sort of mostly focused on, and that's why it. You know, I think somebody asked us about biomass as well, and to what extent that factors into things. In terms of the energy transition, which we see as like the most kind of one of the most fundamental drivers of climate change, or the speed of that is going to be one of the most fundamental drivers. That ratio is the most important to us, I think. So it's definitely most weighted towards that. And I can come back to you and ask more specifically after I've spoken to Catherine about like how we're accounting for things like biodiversity, because I think it's taken into consideration. I could be wrong, but I don't want to give you a wrong answer. So
yeah. No, that's helpful, Zach, and it makes sense that like would be the most impactful thing to target.
Yeah, I will just add to that we don't want, we understand that people who come on the website are very often not, and understandably, and not just focused on climate change either necessarily, because a lot of these things are kind of interconnected, and you find a bank that does one bad thing and you peel the layers back and you find out actually there's a lot more that they do. And we want to recognize that and help people, you know, make even more confident choices of who they switch to. So one thing we've spoken about recently is we're getting closer relationship to the Fair Finance International. I'm not sure if anyone's heard of that, but I would definitely encourage Googling it. They are funded by Oxfam, and they have international subsidiaries all over where they do similar analysis to what we're doing on emissions and fossil fuels, but to everything, you know, from human rights, you know, slavery, arms trafficking, all these other types of ethical things that banks could be facilitating. And they provide a score based on that. And so what we've been talking about is integrating fair finance scores wherever we can get them onto our own pages as well. So hopefully soon you'll also be able to see like an additional score that might link to the page on that for that bank on Fair Finance International, so you can get a much wider perspective. Yeah.
So what did you say it was called? Fair Finance?
Yeah, Fair Finance International. Yeah.
I'm just going to put it in the chat so people can.
Yeah, definitely worth having a look at them.
And it strikes me that chances are that the banks that do very well on scores with fossil fuels are probably likely also to be banks that are good at financing, you know, biodiversity and rewilding and all these kinds of things, because that's the way they've been thinking. It seems to me quite unlikely that one of the very worst banks is then also going to be one of the best in in an area like biodiversity. I mean, just instinctively, I feel that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That is true in what we've seen so far. Yeah.
So we don't have any more questions in the chat, but are there any questions that you wish we'd asked? Or have we done well? I was asking you that, Zach.
Oh, sorry.
Are there any questions that you feel we should have asked that we haven't asked?
I thought you were asking the rest of the audience. Sorry,
No,
that makes a lot more sense. That makes a lot more sense.
There's something that you wish we'd asked you and we didn't.
Yeah. I suppose one question that comes up sometimes is sort of what happens if these banks do divest from those fossil fuel companies. It seems to the untrained eye that then they would just go out of business without that working capital that I was talking about. That tends to not be true. What can happen is that the investments sort of or the loans fall into the hands of less scrupulous actors, like, you know, sovereign wealth funds or private equity firms, people like who are kind of immune to that public pressure. However, so this might seem like a fatal argument to the whole cause. It's like, well, why are we divesting? Because someone else will pay the bill. But it means it's harder for them to raise that capital. Like the rates are less favorable. Generally speaking, it's a net negative on the business, and not to mention that doesn't always happen, right? The business has to have good fundamentals as well, and other things. So it's just sort of like painting them more into a corner. So that's sort of the response that I would give, and also, you know, this is. There's also the flip side of it, as I've mentioned, that if you're putting your money with a bank that's investing in the future, then it's going to have that is going to have a very positive effect. And also, you know, divestment in general, I think there needs to be more public disapproval of what these banks are doing, because regulators should be taking more notice and improving their policies on these areas and things like that. So there are a lot of sort of intangible benefits as well that occur by making a big noise about this issue. I see Marco had a question. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed.
I thought Marco may have had a question. Sorry. Impact of network of companies.
Yeah, there's one just come in from Marco around whether you consider the impact of network of companies financed by banks, so that they can fuel climate change war, intensive farming indirectly.
Yeah, I think that's sort of beyond our capabilities at the moment. But I think, yeah, I mean, there is a measurement. There's another methodology called PCAF, which measures the carbon intensity across a bank's entire portfolio. So not just fossil fuel companies, but which are the sectors that are responsible for the most emissions, even if they aren't the ones sort of sourcing those emissions, like the fossil fuel industry. Yeah, so I think to us, there's enough raw material there to work with, as it were, that we don't also need to do that, because our whole theory of change, as we say, is that if you can cut off, you know, the supply to those who are actually extracting the fossil fuels, then all those kind of supplementary benefits will happen. So again, not to seem that I don't think it's an important issue, but I think both in terms of the Pareto principle and like where most of the problem lies, I think we have enough evidence of like the actual source of the problem, and also organizationally, you know, we're still volunteer driven, and I just don't know if we have that sort of research capacity to start going beyond the actual initial companies that are being funded, if that makes sense. Do you want to ask Alan's question?
Yeah. Thoughts on pensions? Yeah.
So there is a great organization that is not our area, and from what we've seen, it's quite a immovable area as well. You know, pensions obviously do have sort of fiduciary duties, and you know, ultimately need to sort of make a profit, and I think it's something that can happen. But the relationship's not the same as it is with a bank and their customers. And so the organization that I would look at, so again, as I've said many times, not to discount it, it's an important area. We've chosen to focus on banking because we think we can have more leverage in that domain. But there are avenues of action that you can take. And the organization that I would refer you to is called Make My Money Matter. Some of you may be familiar with. It was started by Richard Curtis, the for Wennington funeral guy. And they put out some brilliant media as well, with Olivia Colman recently, where she dresses up in black latex and she is the fossil fuel industry. They started out just in pensions. They've now branched into banks, and I actually have an email from them today I need to reply to about that. But they are in the UK. They are the epicenter, I think, of applying pressure on pension funds to divest as well. So yeah. I have not communicated. So this would, Rosie. Oh, sorry, I don't want to step on your toes, Eve. Do you want to ask?
No, you go for it. You go for it, Zach.
Yeah. Have you communicated with radio programs and journalists like Felicity Hanna, who's very interested in green issues? Obviously, we have done media. That's how Eve came across us and why I'm here, effectively. But it's, until now, as I mentioned, been mostly a question of kind of inbound requests. But I expect over the next sort of 6 to 12 months, we're going to be doing a lot more and actually seeking out those opportunities. So I suppose I should add in terms of what you can do, if anyone has any personal relationships with podcasts or anyone, any type of journalist that can help us to solve this, to close this awareness gap, then I would be very receptive to that too. But I'm going to make a note of Felicity Hanna, and I do have a list of outreach targets, we could say, and I haven't heard of her actually, so I'll add her to that. So thank you, Rosie.